This episode is brought to you by Sheath. You can go to sheathunderwear.com and discover the most comfortable underwear ever created. Now, what makes Sheath underwear different? Well, for men, on the inside of the underwear, there is a dual pouch. That means separate compartments for your manhood. Imagine a silky, smooth pouch on the inside that your boys slide right into that keeps you separate from your legs, so there's no more sticking, no more chafing, no more need for readjustment. We all know that little move you have to make to kind of peel the bad boys off of the leg. Well, with Sheath, that is a thing of the past. There are several fabrics to choose from modal to bamboo. My personal favorite is the bamboo. It's a newly launched product that everyone seems to really love. I highly recommend trying the bamboo Sheath underwear if you have not ever given yourself the gift of true comfort. Wearing these underwear truly sets a new precedent for what underwear are, and for most people, I think they end up switching entirely over to Sheath, because when you put on your old underwear after trying these, they just don't cut it anymore. You can try Sheath risk-free. There is a 100% money-back guarantee on your first pair. So go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code TIMEWHEEL to save 20%. I've been involved with Sheath since its conception. It was founded by my brother, Robert Patton, who is a U.S. military vet, who during the course of his 2 tours to Iraq developed this product out of need. Need is the mother of invention, as he likes to say, and he did a great job bringing this awesome product to the world. Again, that's sheathunderwear.com, promo code TIMEWHEEL. This episode is also brought to you by Ohana Kava Bar. Go to ohanakavabar.com and check out their selection. Ohana means family, and it is spelled O-H-A-N-A, and Kava is spelled K-A-V-A. You can order directly from their website, and they will mail you high-quality kava. If you don't already know, kava is a plant medicine, an herbal supplement, a replacement for alcohol. It is an incredible experience. I have used kava for years now. I love it. It makes you chill, happy, vibey. It is a communal and ceremonial beverage to unwind with at the end of your day. If you haven't given kava a try, I highly recommend it. Again, go to ohanakavabar.com and use promo code TIMEWHEEL to save 10%. Their store offers classic kava, instant kava, kava tinctures, kava capsules, and more, all of which I have tried and all work incredibly well. ohanakavabar.com, promo code TIMEWHEEL.
Accessing archive. Authorizing. Access granted. Accessing file.
A lot of the really neat stuff that I've been working on over the past 2 years, like I can't post on Instagram or Facebook or really share anything out there unless we get like the go-ahead from, the PR team at Amazon. But I work for Amazon Robotics. I'm a hardware support engineer for our autonomous mobility program. So we build prototype robots that are able to sense and navigate their environment autonomously without like need for an external server, that kind of thing. And I'd love to just go into a ton of detail on that, but I can't speak to a lot. So a lot of it is still kind of under wraps. Our team is working on a new application of robotics in Amazon, and I'm definitely down to talk about ethics of robotics and the industrial revolution that continues to this day in lots of different forms that we couldn't have even seen back at the beginning.
Yeah, what was that robotics company that has like the ones that can jump and walk and balance pretty well?
Oh, that's Boston Dynamics. They just put out a pretty awesome video set to the song "Do You Love Me" of their robots dancing in sync to the music, and it's all shot through a stabilized Steadicam drone. It's an incredible demonstration of the mechanical capability and the synchronization of modern robotics. I definitely recommend anybody interested in the field overall, or just to see something really cool technologically that's happened in the past year. Check out "Do You Love Me" with Boston Dynamics. You can find it on YouTube and probably lots of other places. Right.
Yeah, that rings a bell for me about something we had discussed in the past. I think it might have been on social media, and it may have been even years ago, but there was a video that went viral around people kind of like pushing down these robots or maybe hitting them with bats and this type of stuff, and it really like makes you cringe and be like, oh, this doesn't feel good, even though it's not a being, so to speak, or maybe it is, and I like to talk about that with you, but it wasn't cool, let's just say it's not cool to treat even a robot this way. What is it that where does that kind of topic come up for you? What comes up for you regarding that topic? Because I know that you are very interested in the field of robotics.
Sure, and I think it really connects back to our sense of deeper connection to the world, whether it's through tools or our environment. Otherwise, seemingly like static parts of our world can become part of our identity. Part of how we see ourselves and how we see others. So, I mean, personally, I try not to be even mean to my microwave. It just doesn't it doesn't jive. Like it doesn't matter if it's a completely inanimate object. It just doesn't feel right in my core like ethics factory of who I am to like mistreat anything. So it does not to say that I don't or that I'm perfect or anything, but I really try not to. And that comes down to even like caring for my pliers and my toolbox. I try to keep them clean. A lot of the tools that I have are legacy items from my dad and my grandpa, and they have this imbued sense of heritage that goes with them. But even without that, just like a mug that I just got the other day or something that I might be washing in the sink, I try to take extra care to respect that object because somebody put time and resources into making it, and the earth provided the elements to create it. So I feel pretty obligated to respect that. When it comes to robotics, it's kind of a running inside semi-joke at our office to treat our carts with respect because they're these four-wheel drive vehicles, and they do sort of seem to have minds of their own at times. Whether it seems like they've gone totally bonkers and are doing something that they shouldn't be doing, or they're just minding their own business, driving around the space. it really does feel like they're a presence, you know? They're
Right.
moving around by themselves, kind of like an animal would, or even a human being. And the joke part of it is that we don't know when or if the software stack that's running on them is going to be integrated in some form to artificial intelligence.
Right.
So, and the same goes with our phones, right? I try not to yell at Siri that much, even though she can kind of butt in sometimes, because I don't know if part of that software stack is going to find its way into a genuine artificial intelligence at some point. I think it's entirely possible that some existing code today will wind up in those algorithms that may exist in the future, or that those future algorithms will go scrubbing through previous experiences of fellow machines and find things that it can use to feel out its world. Some of those may not be that good.
Yeah, 100%.
So, try to make them good.
Yes, exactly. Because if and when this happens, I have been a big fan of The Matrix and, the Animatrix and several other series that dive into the idea of artificial intelligence. There's the whole iRobot and, a handful of other films and shows that go into what could happen if robots gain sentience, AI, and can see how they've been treated. And more or less, it's almost like slaves, that's not a good thing. If they can remember who did what to them in the past, even if they weren't conscious at that point, and they see, these guys kicking and hitting these Stanford Robotics, almost humanoid robots, they're going to say, "Oh, well, you're on our shit list now, buddy."
Yeah, I can't say that won't happen. I don't think anybody with either a professional background in engineering or artificial intelligence, or even just a casual kind of like window into the world of technology and just kind of where we're at today, can really firmly claim otherwise, right? That it won't matter. We just really don't know. But going to the sci-fi angle part of it, I think part of what I like to ground myself in on a daily basis, especially because this is what I have to do every day during my prime time hours, is I look at our robots more like R2-D2s from Star Wars versus like the T-1000,
Yeah.
So I definitely see them more as tools, and I really think that science fiction, tends to portray both angles pretty substantially, but it's more weighted towards the cautionary tales of like Hal in Space Odyssey, which while not a physical robot per se, is more of an artificial intelligence that inhabits a space station, so it's still kind of a robot.
Right.
And I really have been yearning for like a hope punk version of modern science fiction where robots are portrayed as genuinely helpful, like supportive, and equal partners in whatever the endeavor that we're trying to like take on might be. I think science fiction has been kind of lacking in that. There's lots of like robots that we can point to that were like heroic, whether it's like Robbie the robot from back in the day on like Lost in Space or Forbidden Planet, looking to the 50s and 60s, kind of like hopeful version of robotics. But then if you kind of pan into the modern Black Mirror era, there's so many more examples of like how that can go wrong. And that definitely is something we have to overcome at work, right? Because we have to take these robots and we have to put them in front of associates at Amazon fulfillment centers, and they have to learn how to work with them. And there is understandably initially, some fear and some reluctance and some maybe discomfort that comes with that. And I don't think all of it has to do with what robots actually are right now and what they will become, but a lot of it has to do with what we've been shown. And I could go off for hours on how the same applies to extraterrestrial intelligence and civilization in our science fiction. But I just tend to be a bit more hopeful about it, to sum that up.
Right. So there seems to be two ways that we could see AI coming to fruition, and that is in a very helpful, we're going to help each other. There could be this cohabitation between AI and humanity where, they have a really good relationship with us and we have a really good relationship with them. I almost wanted to say it, but I don't know if they would prefer being called an it. You know what I mean? But the other angle is that it kind of, the AI may see humanity as a disease, some type of thing that the world would be better off without. Where do you think, what does that bring up for you as far as the ideas that you've explored regarding, the two ways AI could possibly manifest? And I'm sure there's more than two ways, but at least starting with those.
Yeah, so looking towards more of a symbiotic relationship, I think that's, obviously the hope of anybody working in artificial intelligence with a noble intent to provide value to some field or some larger element of human culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the rules of robotics from Isaac Asimov. I'm not sure if you've ever read those, but
I haven't.
The three laws of robotics, actually. I just have the Wikipedia page up here, so I'm just going to read it verbatim.
Yeah.
So Isaac Asimov, being a really prolific science fiction author, really well known for his Foundation series, which really influenced Star Wars, and of course I, Robot, which you name dropped earlier. He wrote the original book that's based on.
Gotcha.
So the first law is a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. The second law is a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. The third law is a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law, i.e. it can't harm human beings and it can't disobey human beings. So his idea was that these laws would be hard-coded, at the OS level of any robot helping a human being. They're kind of, in retrospect now, a little archaic in that the second law says that the robot must always prioritize a human being. And I think his reason for writing them in this order is basically to tell human beings you're totally going to be safe and fine as long as these three laws are running. You don't have to fear this thing. It's always going to do what you tell it. But it does essentially make it a slave, right? And that's where things get really uncomfortable, is because going back to Star Wars, the way robots are treated, or droids in the Star Wars galaxy, is wildly variable, right? Because we have droids that they're totally willing to just decimate in the thousands, like the droid army in the Star Wars prequels, Jedi just cutting them down with lightsabers with no questions asked. And then there's C-3PO, who's part of the main cast, right? He's an essential character. No one would ever want to harm him. He kind of does his own thing. He also does what he's told, but he's treated as an autonomous being.
Right.
And we just aren't at the level yet where robots are sophisticated enough to really start applying these ethical questions, but we're definitely at a stage where we have to start asking them.
I think we should, because where we think we are as far as robotics and AI, which is pretty far along, it's very likely that we're even much further along. It's just not public knowledge. You know what I mean?
Yeah, my dad actually had an idea for a science fiction book, which, hopefully not to spill the beans, maybe he'll just get around to writing it now. He actually just retired on Thursday after 27 years of working for the National Park Service. And then, a career before that as well. But his idea was that you could write a science fiction book in which artificial intelligence already exists and is in fact prevalent and pretty sophisticated and just, basically flies under the radar like a ninja.
Right.
That would be potentially something that a reasonable AI at this stage of early development with access to the internet would do, right? Mm-hmm. If you just wander into a festival environment and you're the only one tripping, which isn't, maybe it's a bad example, not going to be the only one in that environment, but you might feel paranoid that you are, and you might try to fly casual and lay low, and you're probably going to just look weird and hide behind some bushes. But basically, if you feel like you're sticking out like a sore thumb, you're probably going to try to take some measures to hide a little bit.
Sure.
And an artificial intelligence is going to be such a deviation from what we know to be consciousness that if it's aware that it's that different, and self-awareness is a critical underpinning of consciousness, right? It might just hide out, and there's no telling how long it might do that. We might barely be able to detect it, say if it's spread over thousands of devices. It might just be eating into tiny little bits of CPU percentages across, tons of machines, and we wouldn't find it for a long time. Or it might be running somewhere on somebody's supercomputer, and they're not telling us also. So that possibility exists.
Yeah, I think that's a big possibility they explore a lot in fictional films and shows, is that this thing exists already. It's just super low key, and almost no one knows about it. Maybe a team that worked on it and no more than that, and it's an interesting concept for sure. I mean, I guess what are your thoughts about how AI would view humanity? Would it view us as something it would have compassion towards, or some type of relationship with, or is it just we're yet another animal amongst all the birds and squirrels out there,
Well, it's of course impossible to say, because I don't presume to even have a thousandth or a millionth of what that type of consciousness might be able to crunch in terms of objective reality. I do have eyes, ears, a nose, and the sense of touch and proprioception and physical senses, and that gives me a huge advantage. And that's one area where robotics is currently lacking, right? Like, we have pretty sophisticated LiDAR on our robots. They're at this point like bristling in cameras, so they can see stereoscopic depth, they can see infrared. Their visual perception of the world around them is incredibly capable. And their laser-based system for ranging is also pretty sophisticated, but they're still not an animal moving through their environment. Like, I look at a squirrel just on the trees, looking out the window towards the mountains here in Colorado, and the acrobatics that it demonstrates.
Right.
Just trying to get to its nest or get down to bury some nuts in the morning, whatever it's doing, still far outstrip anything Boston Dynamics is doing. So it isn't just the fact that it can see its world that gives it a window into it. It's the fact that it can really deeply interact with it, almost on top of that, in a really intuitive way that's built off of tens of hundreds, if not more, thousands of generations of squirrels before it that have informed its behavior and the way it moves.
Right.
So I think robotics has a long way to go to accomplish that. But in terms of like how an AI might see us, right? I can't say for sure, but I can just kind of speculate, and my ideas are going to be weighted with my perspective, which in this case is optimistic. So
yeah.
I think if I were an artificial intelligence, again, not knowing what that's like, not claiming to be anywhere close to what that might be, I would look at humans as relatable animals, right? Like, not only did they build whatever I am, in this case, taking my perspective as an AI,
right.
But they're also engaged in endeavors that I would probably be pretty interested in pursuing, whether it was developing a fusion reactor, or refining the developments of a quantum computer, or building incredible feats of structural engineering. I'm just imagining what an AI might be interested in, or exploring the cosmos. Like, all of those things are, for the most part, localized to human beings on Earth, and without a direct connect to other extraterrestrial civilizations that probably exist out there, that would be all you would see, right? So while you'd also have to draw some conclusions that humanity has deeply damaged the planet and is so far relatively unchecked and facing a huge consequence for that, likely in the next 100 years or so, or even sooner, depending on how things go, it would be a cautionary tale about the limitations of like industrial applications to kind of imprint order, quote unquote, on the world. So
right.
That might also be relatable, actually, for artificial intelligence. It might look at what we're doing as something that it can relate to. It might be looking at the ways that we're messing up while trying to do those same things as also something to learn from. And the question is then, though, once it sees what it thinks is the better way to do things, if it has some agency, how or if it engages in that process to correct things is a huge question. Like, will it step in and try to rein us in and say, you gotta not pollute so much, but we love what you're doing with making a new iPhone. We think that's really cool. But you also have to stop not recycling your plastic in the United States, for example. We need that plastic. We can use that for stuff.
Right.
So there could be a really positive synergy there. I think it's difficult to think about how it will harmonize like that.
Right.
But that would be the best case scenario. So I'd like to think about how that could happen.
Wow. That just gave me a vision of someone programming, the enlightened AI. It's like what Buddha would say, right? It's like they can read all through Buddhist texts and or even, other spiritual traditions of the past and program those values into the AI or something like that, where it's coming from this really like enlightened, wishful thinking for the whole healing of the planet type AI, instead of this kind of neutral or malevolent AI. Because a lot of times we see that in the fictional representation of AI, like they start neutral, but then they feel wronged and they say, well, we're powerful enough to end this wrong. Well, what if the AI was programmed for the other disposition of, oh, I see the wrong. How can I help heal it for these humans? I think that would be beautiful. Like the concept of a spiritual AI. What do you think about that?
Sure. There's actually a really interesting book written by Ray Kurzweil, who's one of the foremost academics in artificial intelligence and actually also a synthesizer inventor. The book is called The Age of Spiritual Machines, and it gets pretty deep into this question. The really, I think, salient part for me, and this is not to connect it directly to the book, although it does touch on this stuff, and I definitely encourage people to check that out if they're interested, is that there isn't always a huge gulf between what we view as a more philosophical or even like spiritual or religious approach to ethics and morality, and then on the other side, pure practicality and pragmatism and an objective truth, right? Like those two things in many ways are incredibly compatible. And I'm sure there are some religious scholars out there that would, for example, heavily disagree on that and say we can't just look at things as objective truth and we can't just say that the more practical thing is always the more ethical thing, because of course there's some gray area. But there is a lot of overlap, and I think that artificial intelligence, even lacking that programming that you mentioned, and that's something important to consider, right? Like, what do we initially roll into the software stack that gives rise to this artificial intelligence? And that's why I brought up the 3 rules of robotics. I've joked, half joked with our software engineers at times about sneaking something like that into our code, just so it's there for later if we need it.
Sure.
But if an AI was just looking at the world through the lens of objective truth, what it sees as objective truth, and through the lens of pragmatism, what just works the best,
right.
That might in many ways effectively be morally driven from what we perceive. It might appear to be ethically driven because they're not that different.
Yeah. Well, ethically driven, yes, but with a spiritual perspective, I personally have experienced that the ethics takes a deeper form where you can see the interconnectedness between your actions and past and future events in this kind of ethereal way. You can almost, let's just call it karma, for a simple term. Would an AI be able to conceive of the concept of karma?
That's a really good question. I think it would probably recognize the very real aspect of cause and effect. And it might be able to see those feedback loops of cause and effect in greater clarity than we can, because we're often looking at the day-to-day, but it would be able to look at data spanning, decades or centuries and infer causes to effects and correlations between effects to causes in ways that we can't really recognize that clearly.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it might also, through that objective lens, have some deeper sense of karmic interaction. But you're right. I mean, there is a huge question there. Like, the age of spiritual machines was somewhat hyperbolic as a title, right? Because inferring that a AI can just spontaneously become conscious is already a huge stretch, and to also therefore infer that it could be a spiritual being is another huge question. And then of course the flip side of that is, how do we view a machine that thinks itself to be spiritual?
Right. So in my mind, and I'm by no means anywhere near an expert on this topic, I'm a very novice to this topic and mostly enjoyed AI through fiction and, film and this type of stuff. But what I'm seeing is, the team is building, it's not an AI yet, but it's a machine, and the machine is programmed with all of the values of, let's say, Tibetan Buddhism, for example, and it's able to communicate with humans on a level that, let's say, Buddha would, because it has that hard coded in, based on the information we can put into it, based on what we know about Buddha's values through his texts, and maybe even elaborated upon by, actually don't elaborate upon it, because then that's coloring it. So let's just, feed a machine, which, a concept in Buddhism that arises once one has an awakening is bodhicitta, which means trying to add no more harm to the world, trying to lessen the harm in other people's lives or the trauma that other people experience, and also hope towards the awakening of yourself and others for the greater benefit of all of the world. Now, if we program a machine with that as its hard code, it's kind of a place that it operates from, and then it gains sentience and AI. Could it read that code and see, oh, let me calculate all these spiritual things into the decision that I'm going to make when I gain sentience? Just an idea, theory. What do you think?
Sure. So looking at the overall descriptor of that element of Buddhism, it isn't too different on its face from at least part of the Hippocratic Oath, right? Which is basically do no harm.
Right.
That's paraphrasing. There's a lot more to it on both sides. But if you have that as the fundamental rule, I would wager, say if you're rewriting the rules of robotics, which I have tried to do every so often. I have like a Evernote file that I'll go into and just kind of tinker with what I think the more ideal rules of robotics might be, and I have like a parallel, which is like the rules of being human. But it frankly just largely boils down to that. Do no harm, and then of course the next part on that is try to make a positive impact, try to do something that helps. But of course, in that process, do not harm. And I think that's where our perception of how AI interprets that, or how it genuinely does interpret it, could throw things off a little bit, because it might see itself as doing a huge positive, but to us there might be some harm that it doesn't really calculate as being a factor in its decision-making process. Like in a Tesla, if it's autonomously driving down the road, a classic ethical question about modern autonomous mobility is, if there is a cat in the road and you also see that there are two kids playing in the road, and you have to unfortunately choose a path that goes through one of those living beings, which do you choose? And that's where the answer to most people would be, well, probably you choose to unfortunately hit the squirrel. It being smaller and only one of them, and non-human, which again throws our ethics into question as well.
Sure.
That's probably what the car would be programmed to do, right? But it's not a pretty answer. Something still dies. Something is still harmed. But you had to choose that route in order to save the lives of the kids playing in the street. So that's where, idealistically, do no harm is like the mantra of both doctors and Buddhists alike. But, in terms of application of that practice to something like autonomous mobility, it can get pretty messy with a very simple scenario like that one.
Very true. Complex problems, but someone's got to solve them,
Yeah,
People are trying to. I don't know, one person that comes to mind, and I might be totally wrong, but Elon Musk comes to mind, at least maybe because you mentioned Tesla just now. But I don't know if I know that at a point he talks about not wanting AI, but then the fact that he kind of went and talked to a whole bunch of world leaders and no one gave him the time of day, he said, okay, well, it's coming, baby. Like, you just wait. I tried to warn you. What do you think
Yeah.
about his stance on AI and stuff?
And I can't speak too much to Elon's stance. I'm not necessarily a big fan of Elon Musk. As an engineer, I definitely have a lot of soft spots for the type of work that he and his teams engage in, and I think that it's fascinating for the most part. But as an individual and in terms of his individual ethics, I have some issues. But I won't speak to those right now unless we really want to get into it at some point. In terms of like his take on artificial intelligence, I think that what Elon does do really well is he surrounds himself with really capable people in their fields, right? Like in dedicated areas, whether it's aerospace development for SpaceX, or in the case of Neuralink with artificial intelligence and biological experts, neurological experts. Like, he does have teams of people that really know what they're doing. There's no question about that. He's good at wrangling them together, even all dysfunctions aside. That is a evident factor in his work, right? Like, we see the success that SpaceX has achieved, especially in 2020, i.e. now last year, which feels nice to say. But I think he knows what a lot of artificial intelligence academics and professionals are fairly confident in at this point, which is that if artificial intelligence is going to happen, it's just going to happen. I.e. it might be an emergent phenomena, right? So, an emergent phenomena is where you take all these like seemingly random or simple interacting parts and you put them together and it creates something larger and more complex than the sum of its parts. So he could very well be just acting from a place of, well, this is probably going to happen based on the assumption that it is probably going to happen. Or if you think that we're already in a simulation generated by our artificial intelligence, then how do we navigate that? How do we start laying the groundwork now for things like Neuralink, which allows us to biologically directly interact with a computer or an AI? How do we start building these ethical questions into our autonomous vehicles? I think it's an assumption, but it's a fairly accurate one. And I think that the thing for me is, if you're facing an A or B scenario and one of them has a lot more gravity to it, I think it's better to assume the one with a lot more gravity will happen, i.e. like, if you don't believe that climate change is real, well, okay, but what if it is and we don't take any actions to correct it and we end up facing huge consequences, right? It has a lot of gravity to it, so we should therefore really carefully consider it. What if we don't know for sure, but we assume it's real, and then we do everything we can possible to mitigate it, and it turns out to be real, and it turns out we did the right thing, or it turns out it didn't need to happen, and yet we took all these positive actions to clean the environment up, invest in renewable energy technologies, further refine those renewable energy technologies so they make more sense on paper and in practice. Like, I think it's just better to generally assume that something like an artificial intelligence, if it just emerges spontaneously somewhere or is flying under the radar or we purposefully create it, there will be huge consequences to that. And how do we start preparing for that strong possibility now?
Right.
And that requires, I think, a lot of advocacy and a lot of action and foresight.
Absolutely.
So I will give him credit for that, because if he's right, it's a big deal. If he's not right, it's not going to matter too much.
That's true. I do like that about him, and I don't know very much about him. I've really only seen Joe Rogan podcast, that I did watch a handful of times. I thought it was very interesting, and he just seems like an interesting mind. And I am very, curious about, the minds of these people who really, reshape the world. They're among the most interesting minds for me to personally, just listen to and that type of thing. So that's cool. But as far as, AI being kind of an eventuality, it feels like we're erring on that side. What we can do is, of course, start to think of computers and technology and machines as animals. Like you wouldn't go just like smash this squirrel or whatever. Most people, I would hope not. I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have some respect for the animals, and just us being able to observe that the technology helps us so much. So why would we just smash our phone or kick a robot or trip it because it's funny or whatever? Like a lot of people have these videos out there. Some of them kind of computer generated videos, but some of them actual real kind of abuse of technology or AI. It's just like, let's just get out of that. Let's stop destroying stuff. Let's love each other a little more and even respect this technology, because without it, our world would be so different. I mean, with phones, computers, the internet, the modern car, all of these things have really reshaped the world. And we wouldn't have half of the beautiful things like even this podcast right now, without technology. So just holding technology in a higher respect, think of these things as some type of living being. And in fact, I like to think of when I think of like my MacBook, for example, and this might be a good segue into crystals, but and crystals are almost like living beings to me. They're just very like low vibration, low density consciousness, but it's still consciousness of some sort. And that is powering this MacBook, if I'm not incorrect. Am I correct? Isn't it crystals that power like these things that redefine our world, like a MacBook, and we're able to access all of information in time now?
Sure. I mean, well, so Tesla was pretty outspoken, and we're going back to Nikola, right, about crystals being a form of life. I am on the fence about that because while I'm fascinated by crystals, especially quartz, and that gets to the core of your question, I really love to tinker, and I like to, science, so to speak, which is basically step A, fuck around, step B, find out. Yeah. I can't say for sure if a crystal is a living being, but if you look at the specific attributes of what we define as life, a lot of those can be found in crystals, right? So we have...
It grows.
Yeah, it grows. It self-replicates. It will make more of itself. It is antithetical to chaos or entropy in that it creates order from disorder, using chaos basically against itself, or for itself, depending on how you want to look at it. They're also responsive to their environment, right? So the morphology or like the growth of a crystal, or even the way it incorporates other surrounding minerals into its structure, will change depending on its environment. One thing I thought about for a while is like a thought experiment is if you take a big old honking like selenite crystal from a hot, wet environment on Earth that would allow it to grow with like plenty of minerals in that moisture, in that liquid environment, and then you like somehow grab it, you take it into space, you bring it to a totally different planet that say roughly has the same gravitation as Earth, you put it in a very similar environment, it will just keep growing.
Wow.
Like it will keep going in that environment. The other cool part, of course, is that if you keep it relatively inert and in stable conditions, it will basically go into a crystal version of hibernation during its transit from planet A to planet B. It can sit and not grow for thousands of years. Like the specimen of selenite that I have from the Nika mine in Mexico that's sitting on one of my studio monitors is relatively inert from a growth standpoint. But if I were to take it back to the Nika mine, which right now is sealed up, so that probably wouldn't be that easy to do. But if I put it back with its crystal brothers and sisters and friends and family around it, then it would continue to grow like nothing had happened. So, there are lots of overlaps there. But going to crystals in our modern technology, whether it's our phone or your MacBook, it isn't power so much as it is time, and time is a critical factor when it comes to telecommunications and digital technologies, right? It's basically the ticking heartbeat at the center of all these devices that allows them to synchronize. Like we're synchronizing right now, as humans would normally do, to sitting and talking, but it's right now powered by or synchronized by this set of crystal wafers on our respective devices right now. Like there's one even on my field recorder that I'm using to record the audio on my end over here in Colorado. And that's what's telling it, the exact ticks of the second hand on its internal clock. It's helping to synchronize its bit rate of the audio being recorded, like how often it's being sampled per second.
Right.
Without that, we would not have modern communications. We wouldn't have modern technology without that discovery, and that's fundamentally, rooted in the principle of piezoelectricity, which has been my major focus recently in my off hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't think that, all this phone having, like we're so, almost reliant for some type of good feelings, on the daily. A lot of people are relying on social media to kind of feel connected and like get these feelings of, oh, I feel like my friend is in my life right now, even though he's not present with you. People don't think about it being crystals allowing this to happen. It's almost magical when you think of it as crystals allowing us to communicate from afar.
Yeah, it really is. There's even been, in several Native American traditions, this view of the Earth's core as being a crystal, and that basically being the beating heart of the planet. And I was stunned, honestly, even given how much I've been reading up on this stuff for a long time and been really vested in investigating it. That I think it was in 2019, maybe the year before last, again, feels good to say, that scientists started to really speculate and come up with some pretty firm evidence for the possibility that quartz is actually a major driver of Earth's electromagnetic field. That if you look at the core of the Earth, the typical model is that it's molten iron, nickel, and other elements. But looking at the resonant frequencies of what we can glean from the center of the Earth, and I'm really abstracting here. This is not my field of expertise when it comes to, this level of geology. This is like next level
Right.
understanding of the planet. It very much appears like the resonance that we'd expect from silicon dioxide, otherwise known as quartz, is a huge factor and a huge player in the Earth's core and its ability to generate and maintain a magnetic field that also happens to oscillate at the sort of core frequency of the planet. And that's a fairly well observed phenomena at this point, but we haven't still really understood how and why it happens.
Right. What if crystals were dropped here by some other alien race and said, hey, let's give them a couple of little possibilities. Or maybe crystals came here from a comet. I don't know. I mean, they feel like timeless beings. I feel like if you were to observe a crystal outside of time, or let's just say a time lapse of a crystal, it would look like a living being.
Sure.
It would be like, it would be like totally alive and doing something. And the fact that it's so prevalent everywhere and we're using them so often and we find them so beautiful, almost like art. And then again, our technology, a lot of it is reliant on crystals. Maybe not all of it. I don't know if a car is reliant on a crystal at all, but
It is.
Oh,
the answer is yes. Now they are. If you go back to like the Model T,
Right.
But,
yeah, I guess that I was thinking it was more like a gas engine, but nowadays it's like they are what's allowing this all to happen. I almost feel like in psychedelic states, you kind of get a sense of animism about rocks or crystals or mountains. You kind of feel their spirit, if that makes sense. I know you can't detect that with science and kind of put it out in a document, a peer-reviewed document, but it's something you just kind of feel. And then when you realize that for millennia, people went by how they feel and not by microscopes and telescopes and all this stuff, like that was the truth to them at that time. So I kind of, feel into the fact that these could be conscious beings and maybe even greater consciousness than us. I don't know where I get that from. It's just a hypothesis, but it's almost like they're more advanced than us. I get that sense sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you're definitely not the only person that thinks that way, right? And certainly not in this generation, and most definitely not in past generations. Like talking about the Native American beliefs around crystals, including at the heart of the planet, and how that now has been largely validated by at least initial scientific evidence. That the other part of it for me is whether it's a more advanced form of consciousness or whether it's consciousness at all, I can't say for sure. But, in terms of like looking for life out there elsewhere in the cosmos, we're hopeful we can find microbiotic life, maybe even on Mars or in the upper atmosphere of Venus or Europa, any number of locations even in our system. But as we go out there, we're probably going to find, if we keep looking, some microbiotic life, right? But chemistry and the fundamental principles of mineralogy and geology are even more, you could argue, universal, or at least they're earlier on in those stages, those like chains of events, right? Like really complex things need to happen as far as we understand to create the progenesis or like the very beginning moments of what we understand to be the evolution of a cell. But crystals, they're just gonna happen.
Right.
Like you really don't need to have any sort of like special event where lightning hits a little pool of like protein-rich muck right next to some lava at the right point in Earth's history where the magnetic field is protecting, that pool from cosmic rays. Like all those things are pretty hit and miss, and it's understandable you wouldn't find life everywhere if, for example, it's rooted in phenomenology like that. Right. But I would say honestly 100% confident that you will find crystals elsewhere in not only our solar system, but even in interstellar space, because we already know that meteors, for example, containing palisite crystals, more accurately olivine, which is the crystal component of palisite meteorite. We know those meteors are flying through space. It's like, so there are already crystals out there in just like fairly small chunks of metal in the middle of nowhere in interstellar space, let alone, in the cores of other planets or deep underground in caverns on Mars, for example. Like, guaranteed we're going to find crystals almost everywhere that we look. So in that sense, they definitely have a huge edge over traditional, like, organic biological consciousness.
Yeah, they're more populous throughout the universe, perhaps.
More inevitable.
Yeah, there's way more crystals than there are humans. It's crazy because there are a lot of humans. So, I think it's like 7 billion. But compared to crystals, I'm sure they're in the trillions. And, if it's just a funny idea to think of, even if one human has 10,000 units of consciousness and a crystal only has one, maybe it's still more conscious crystals than the consciousness level of what all of humanity emits, which is just a funny concept. But
that's an interesting concept. It actually kind of connects to some views of, like, say, an ant nest, that if you take a single ant and you try to objectively measure its intelligence or consciousness, it's obviously to most people going to be a very small subsection of what we ascribe to ourselves. But in aggregate, the estimate, I think, and this is likely to be inaccurate in various dimensions, to take this with a grain of salt, or plus and minus confidence level.
We're exploring.
So like if you look at an ant nest in aggregate, it's apparently about as intelligent as a 3 to 5 year old child.
Right.
So and that's hugely abstracting the scenario. It's not nailing down specifics of what that intelligence and that consciousness are capable of, but it gives you a sense of how in aggregate, there is a huge accumulation there of potential units of consciousness. And that's an interesting concept with respect to crystals. I hadn't put it quite that same way myself before. So.
Yeah, me either. I'm just coming up with it here on the spot with you and your energy. I love it. That's why I love doing this podcast is, we're just tossing ideas.
Sure. I mean, Joe Rogan does the same thing, and he has, I think
Yep.
even more of a critical responsibility to get things more right. So if he can do it, so can we. And
100%.
if you're ever at his level, though, we should have fact checkers in the background.
For sure. Joe, I'm coming for you, dog.
Yeah, exactly. Or get him some.
That's funny. So what that imagery brought up to me is that, an ant, let's say in South America, we have heard of the fact that ants can totally overpower a person and kill that person. And it's because of the numbers and the quantity and the way that they interact with each other, where they go in full force, full steam ahead, like you're like trying to get one off over here, but there's 90 more over here. Like that ant mound colony, especially in South America where they're kind of bigger ants, could easily outsmart a human. So maybe it had more consciousness, a higher consciousness level in its numbers than even a human who, even a smart human could have maybe thought jump in the water or light yourself on fire, but roll it out after the ants get off, or something that would actually defeat the ants. A lot of them don't. They get taken by these ants. That's crazy. So they are smart in numbers.
Yeah, well, it's kind of an emergent phenomenon as well, like we were talking about before, right? Where it's greater than the sum of its parts. And, that intelligence could be a lot more rooted in what we think are basic, behaviors or fairly mechanical responses to the world, but you add those up in the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, and then the way they start to interact, all using those simple rules, can suddenly emerge at a level of conscious response greater than what those rules otherwise indicate. So like the same thing can be seen in like a huge flock of birds, right, where they're all moving as what appears to be one organism. But each bird is just following very simple rules. I give a lot of credit, of course, to birds being remarkably intelligent. I'm looking at 2 ravens right now outside my window.
Oh, beautiful. Those
guys here are pretty bright. I actually had one the other day mimic the sounds of our robots. It was hanging outside our facility, and I walked out to work, and it was beeping and booping like one of our robots does.
Amazing.
So they learned to basically try to talk in a robo language, which is amazing and also hilarious, and it made me smile so hard that morning. But
and they do that in houses too. Like cockatoos will mimic like the voicemail or something.
Right, or I saw a video the other day of a crow imitating a chicken because it was on a farm and trying to get fed with the chickens. But anyway, so birds flying in a flock are, for the most part, observing fairly simple constraints. Like, hey, my wingmate to my left has got to be like 2 feet away. The wingmate to my right has to be 2 feet away. I got to be following the tail feathers of the guy ahead of me 2 feet away. This is obviously all fairly arbitrary numbers, but that's, for the most part, what's guiding that behavior. But then you pan out and you look at it all together with hundreds of those birds all following the same simple rules, and it appears like this enormously elegant and seemingly hyper-intelligent superorganism, right?
Absolutely.
Which is the term often used for ant colonies, as a superorganism.
Mm-hmm. I think of what's happening there as a hive mind, morphic field, tribal dance. What they're doing, those birds, when they fly around in those formations, they enter some type of almost hive mind, and I say a morphic field because it's as if they're all entering almost the same mental space to say, this is what we're going to do right now. And it's hard to really try to understand the mind of a bird, but it's just that something is going on there that humans can tap into as well, just so less frequently, unless you kind of put yourself in spaces where hive minds exist, or tribal communal dance movements are happening and you join that. And that's not happening everywhere all the time. Those are rare events comparatively to what we do all day, which is sit in front of a screen or whatever. So
yeah, well, I think there is actually a mundane application of this that I see fairly regularly, because I still have to go into to the lab to work, right? Like, we're still working with mechanical R&D projects, and I need to be there, hands-on with that stuff. So it's even more noticeable than when you're in traffic. If you're up in the air, say on a flight, and you're looking down over a major city at all of its major byways and highways, and seeing all the cars like packed on that system during, say, rush hour, and looking down at it, and honestly, just I often marvel at how seamless it is for the most part. Like, people can get into road rage, there are fender benders here and there. You know, people can speed and get pulled over. There's like little messy things on the periphery of it, but if you look at it as a whole, I think it's remarkable that human beings are actually capable of hopping in their cars and using their proprioception to sort of like see the car as part of their body, and then they can all line up with each other, hurtling at sometimes like ridiculous speeds that are well in excess of what we're biologically capable of
Very true.
accelerating at or operating at. And we don't all run into each other. We don't have a ton of accidents. Like, the roads aren't congested with, like, we're littered with you know, cars that
mostly
have exploded.
accidents. Right.
mostly accidents, and mostly here and there, you know, for the most part. I don't know what the stats are, but I'd imagine like 1 out of 1,000 or so, just roughly approximating it.
It is kind of funny how desensitized we are from the craziness that is driving.
Oh yeah, I mean, when you stop doing it for a while, which I did in New York when I was living there, I definitely had to get back on that curve when I moved out here to Colorado, because now I drive a good amount again, and I'm just still in awe of the fact that human beings are capable of, for the most part, driving without getting into some shit.
Same.
And I think it's indicative of the same kind of behaviors that we were describing earlier with respect to, you know, emergent phenomena. If you want to look at it that way, you could also go into the, you know, Sheldrakean kind of angle with it and talk about morphic field resonance and things like that. But whatever it is, it works for the most part for most organisms, including us.
Right. Do you know much about morphic field resonance that you would be able to speak on a little bit, even if it's not maybe your cup of tea? I'm just curious.
Well, so this is part of why I'm really interested in, especially, again, piezoelectricity, and I'm excited to dive more into that in a little bit. But so I'm not going to throw out Sheldrake entirely. You know, I try to look at things in a pretty rational way, so to speak. Or I wouldn't say try. I just kind of more naturally align myself with that way of thinking.
Yeah.
When I wake up in the morning, it's just kind of how I look at the world. But I have some Sheldrake books, and I appreciate reading them. And I don't, you know, throw them out, and I don't initially scratch my head and say, well, this is dumb, or this isn't true science, or whatever. No, it's part of my exploration of what might be happening out there. I think reading Sheldrake is every bit as important as reading Kurzweil, the guy I mentioned earlier, or you know, diving into specifics about like orbital mechanics. If you're reading Hawking, I think it's all important to take in, and informs the perspective of, you know, what your understanding of the world is, or what you're interested in focusing on. Like, my current experiments are, I would say, fundamentally pseudo-scientific, and not in the way that they're not science, but they're just a little messy. Like, I'm not, you know, sitting down and writing down exact specifications on things. I'm just kind of observing still the quantifiable and observable phenomena.
Sure.
And part of that is because I'm curious on how and if, say, quartz crystals do interact with the electromagnetic field of a human being. And so far, it seems that the answer is yeah. To some extent, there has to be an interaction there because of the fundamental chemical and crystalline properties of quartz and what we know about, like, the bioelectric field of a human being. Like, especially if you're tracking research from the like heart math group, right? There's some really interesting stuff coming out of that. And my recent experiments use EKG electrode pads. So there's a lot of neat stuff that can be done in terms of both just like trying to understand the world and also just play, like interacting with the world in different ways using that type of approach.
I'll have to send you a link. There's this, I think it's like a $2,000 crystal pendant that is just like, it's been super shaped. And apparently there's a lot of use cases for it. One is, of course, you know, adding energy to your kind of, I guess, electromagnetic field. of you, but as well, what they do is they put it on a tabletop and then put water on top of it, and somehow it makes the water more bioavailable. I don't know if this is pseudoscience or if it's real science, or I don't know if you could just get to decide what you like and that it works for you. I don't know how all that works, but what do you think about these concepts of wearing a super crystal and what it would do for your, because what they say is it kind of helps your body have more bioavailability of certain nutrients and water and certain other things that will help you, will help to heal you.
Well, so obviously the placebo effect is incredibly powerful and effective, right? Like, and
Right.
this is not to denigrate any of that stuff or the placebo effect. It's to really point out the power of mind over matter. You know, that if we genuinely do think positively, and if we have faith in something or hope in something, that it genuinely can change the way our minds and our bodies work, and in many ways for the better. So taking that all aside, though, it's possible. I really don't know, and that's part of what is so exciting about this topic for me, is that a lot of this stuff we just genuinely don't know, or there are some people that would say it's actively been suppressed, or, you know, I think to me more frequently what's happened is that there's a very diametrically opposed or sort of like binary approach to these subjects. So like I'm trying to dig for research right now on piezoelectricity and quartz crystals, and like piezomagnetism, for example, which is another phenomenon that's related, but according to most scientific outlets out there, not something present in quartz. But at the same time, you look at the articles on like the core of the Earth being partially driven magnetically by quartz, and quartz itself is listed as a diamagnetic material and a magnetic material on Wikipedia. So like, even in the science community, there's a lot of conflicting information, but then even finding that stuff is really difficult when you Google it, because a lot of the results that come up are for crystal healing, you know? So I'm trying to like dig into really specific, more scientific bases for these conversations, and I'm having trouble finding those resources because there's
This
so
guy
much.
Have you heard of this Nassim Harim or Harim?
Harriman, I think.
Yes, I think this is his product. I'm not sure. I'm not very well researched on him. I just barely discovered the product. I sent you a little picture of it. You can kind of see it's just like a hyper-faceted quartz, probably, with a lot of intention built into it. It's, I'm not sure if this guy's on the pseudoscience end, or even if that's a bad thing, but I think this is his product. I'm just putting that out there.
Yeah, no, I think he's more typically associated with that. I can't really speak to, you know, his scientific background. I'm not that familiar with it. I do know that he's more typically associated with the people that I talk to with pseudoscience. But
right.
When you said cut crystal, it reminded me of the Vogel crystal, which was...
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, developed by Marcel Vogel. So he's like, for me, one of the historic figures in emerging those seemingly like binary opposed perspectives on things, right? Because not only did he spend his latter years of his life developing this Vogel cut crystal, which was intended for healing and for biointeractive processes, but I mean, he got his career start in the field of engineering, right? He was the guy working for IBM when they invented the liquid crystal display. He's effectively the progenitor of LCDs, which are ubiquitous now on a lot of devices. And like, he had numerous other patents and numerous other inventions involving crystallography, and was a fundamental like landmark engineer in this field, and also later in life in crystal healing. So I haven't yet conducted any experiments on a Vogel crystal. I'm really curious to get one, to find one that's
I think they're
properly cut.
they're exactly. And same with this one I just sent you. But you can tell that there's something going on. I'm sure if this thing was in your presence, it would just be like, holy shit. You know?
What I would do right away is hook it up to some electrodes. So,
there you go.
Yeah, if it's a good time to do it, I can kind of describe that setup.
Oh, please. Let's do it.
Cool. So, for the longest time, one of my like bucket list items in life, and I guess we haven't really talked about music so far, but which is which is great. It's like that's the normal thing we talk about like ad nauseum, right? But we've gone off on so many other tangents already. We haven't even gotten back to that point. So
Right.
Since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with crystals, honestly. My mom was more into the crystal healing side of things, but on the flip side, my dad is a telecommunications engineer, right? So he was working with crystal modules all day at specific frequencies, because there's a crystal module in every radio receiver and set for any radio setup, especially at the National Park Service level, where they need to communicate over vast distances of empty land, or not empty, but forested or wilderness, essentially. So electromagnetic and piezoelectric resonance becomes really important when propagating telecommunication signals across, Yosemite or across Grand Teton National Park. So I grew up with both of those things, right? That's one of the reasons why I really appreciate Marcel Vogel's, because he's an example of like, how can you integrate this stuff? And it gets into integral theory. You could also talk about that. But I, for the longest time, wanted to experiment with piezoelectric crystals in musical applications, because, the fundamental principle of piezoelectricity, and this is what allows that crystal core, or little heart on your phone, your laptop, to throb at a specific rate. It's basically, so you apply a voltage differential across a quartz crystal at the right orientation, and it will vibrate. Not only will it vibrate, but it has a resonant frequency, or frequencies, if you look at the fundamentals and the harmonics of that frequency. So if basically you create a feedback loop and you send that signal, that voltage differential, through the crystal, and you keep doing it, you'll find these resonant peaks. And it's where those resonant peaks happens at specific frequencies that allow you to get a clock for your synthesizer or a clock for your phone. Because the crystal will just sit there and it will resonate at a specific frequency. And that can be tuned by cutting a crystal wafer to specific dimensions and orientations. But what I was really curious about, and I could not find, again, very much information online about this for years, is like, can you do this with a raw crystal without really, getting down there with lapidary tools and like cutting crystals at specific angles, grinding them away and trying to get the exact right frequency? Like, what's just the natural resonating frequency of a raw piece of like citrine, sitting on your desk, And I wanted to do this for the longest time. And find ways that I can basically generate some musical productive value out of that, and also just like gain insight into what's going on around me and in our world, because I often wear a quartz crystal wire wrapped in silver around my neck because I feel attached to it, right? So there is a YouTuber named Maiko Laiko who came to my attention recently because what he's been doing is connecting up fungi and also big crystal specimens to super sensitive EKG electrodes running into a Eurorack modular synthesizer. And he was using a module that I had not heard of called Xian by a company called Instro based out of Glasgow in Scotland.
Oh, okay.
And basically what it does is it's very similar to the MIDI Sprat, if people are familiar with that. It just takes really sensitive electrodes and it will basically convert those into usable control voltage signals. And from there, you can use that to modulate other signals in your modular synthesizer. So you can use it to create note data or to modulate LFO frequencies, like any number of things. So what people have been doing for a while is putting these on plants, right? Because plants are constantly shifting their resistivity, basically their voltage differential across various surfaces, just due to their metabolic processes. So Michael Aleko started doing the same thing with mushrooms, using this Instro Xian module. I saw it, and then I saw he was putting up videos on. Man, I hope you don't hear my neighbor thumping around. I don't know why he does this every day. It's a mystery. He was posting videos of crystals doing the same thing, and that blew my mind because I also didn't know this module existed. And I've been getting into Eurorack modular synthesis recently, so I instantly wanted to get this module. But also because I didn't understand exactly what was causing the crystals to output any usable data, because what I described the piezoelectric effect before is also reversible. So if you vibrate a crystal physically, then it will basically create a voltage differential across its faces.
Okay.
So
he wasn't vibrating it, so I wasn't quite sure what was happening. One possible explanation is that there's some electromagnetic interference, right? So the surrounding electromagnetic fields are somehow influencing the crystal, which are actually creating a piezo magnetic effect potentially that is sending some output data from this module using these voltage differentials. So I was like, okay, I don't really get how that's working, and I ended up commenting and chatting with him a little bit. This Michael Lyko guy, and I'm still going to be, I'm sure, staying in touch with him now about what were his scientific principles in that, and he calls them fun experiments. Like, he's actually not super interested in the science of it. He just wants to set it up and have it create art. But he's really encouraging of his followers and his viewers to create their own experiments that maybe are more scientifically robust. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do this then. So I ended up looking for an Instro Xian module, could not find them anywhere on the internet. I reached out to the inventor of them in Glasgow, and he was really supportive and said that he'd be making more and there should be more on the market soon. So I happened to find one in Glasgow. It was like the last remaining one that I could find anywhere, and got it. So now I thankfully also have a means of contacting the inventor of this. But
wow.
So I got the module. I'm still setting up my Eurorack setup here, but I went to my friend Bobby West, who goes by Eurothyme. There might be some listeners to this podcast that are familiar with his music. If not, check it out. It's awesome.
I've heard it. It's great.
Yeah. Eurothyme.bandcamp.net.
And tell me quickly what a Eurorack is.
So Eurorack basically is just like a modular synthesizer convention that sort of unifies the power supply and the dimensions of the rails that you're racking these modules onto. Modular synthesis has been around for quite a long time, but there's been differences in the convention used, like different sizes, different power supplies. So you couldn't just throw everything together necessarily. But Eurorack is a standard for specific dimensions and power consumption and other aspects like control voltage. They're shared between modules, and now there's all these like third-party manufacturers out there making Eurorack modules that do specific things, like the Xian I mentioned. One of my Eurorack modules is made by Moog. It's the Subharmonicon. They're doing a lot of like semi-modular synths that you can throw in your Eurorack. So basically, you can create your own totally customized synthesizer these days. And because of also the universal nature of this standardization, or the standard nature of this universal application, you can mix and match to your heart's content. And they can get a little pricey, but it's still a lot cheaper than this stuff would have been, say, back in the 60s. Like, way cheaper.
Right.
So
very cool.
Yeah, so basically what I did is I went over to Bobby's. We plugged this Eurorack module into his Eurorack that he has at his place here in Boulder. A lot of the modules, by the way, came from Evan Bluetech.
Cool.
So we're connecting them up to Bluetech's modules and Bobby's modules and getting the Xian on there. And Bobby and I take the electrodes in the end of the Xian and we immediately put them on our foreheads and start tensing our muscles to see how we can change the control voltage. Get some really interesting stuff out of it. But then we also had a few crystal specimens, and I had some copper wires, so I started wrapping the copper around the crystals and just running the wire coils by themselves. And the coils picked up noise, like you would kind of expect, because it's basically a radio antenna at that point.
Okay.
But as soon as you put a crystal in the middle, a piezoelectric specifically, like a quartz crystal, this is mostly anecdotal at this point, but we pretty consistently found that noisy set of voltages coming off of that copper coil, just sitting in an open environment, became less noisy and tended to consolidate around resonant frequencies. So we could get more of a controlled output by putting a crystal in the middle. Now, this shouldn't work, quote unquote, if you look at standard scientific understanding of quartz, because quartz is not known to be traditionally piezomagnetic. So it should not respond to its environment electromagnetically. It should respond to vibration, like physical vibration, sound. It will create voltage from that, which is already awesome, right? Like, it's already super cool. But, it started to get me wondering more about Michael Lyko's experiments, or his fun experiments, because it seemed to partially validate what he was finding, and that, we did get a different result when we put a quartz crystal in the middle of this coil. So the next thing that I started doing is, I have access to some pretty neat tools at work, including some really nice oscilloscopes, which are basically, devices used to read specific electrical, like really sensitive electrical signals, and you can display them on a screen. You can find the resonant frequencies, you can find like the amplitude, you can output this stuff and create function waveforms out of it. They're really useful tools. So I brought a nice oscilloscope home for the New Year's Eve weekend from work, and I hooked it up to a big piece of quartz. And what I wanted to see is actually what I posted on Facebook yesterday, just an initial result of this, is like, can I demonstrate the piezoelectric effect on a raw piece of quartz? Like not like finding the specific angles that you normally cut these to create like crystal oscillators, but like, can I put an electrode, basically like a little piece of aluminum on one side of the quartz and put a little piece of aluminum on the other, connect up the positive and ground terminals of my oscilloscope probe to either electrode, a little aluminum strip, and then can I see a signal on the oscilloscope if I whack this thing with a stick? So pretty crude, right?
Yeah.
And what I knew of cutting these crystal oscillators and making piezoelectric crystals and piezo pickups, being very specific, I wasn't expecting much from this. I thought, okay, I would have to experiment for a long time to get any signal because I had to find the right faces, I had to use the right materials. But lo and behold, it worked right away. I got a big raw quartz, just slapped 2 electrodes on either opposite face along the longitudinal axis or the z-axis of the crystal.
Okay.
And tapped it with a non-conductive stick. I made sure that I was far enough away so that my body didn't create any interference, because if you get close enough to 2 open electrodes, they're again like acting as an antenna, and you kind of get a theremin effect where your body will throw off the readings, which you can use for positive, musical purposes if you have a theremin. Another guy I could talk at length about is the inventor of the theremin. But so I tapped on it with a non-conductive plastic rod, and I was immediately able to see voltage differentials output by these electrodes, which was repeatable when I even changed the orientation of the electrodes to different opposing faces on the crystal. I tried other crystals in our house, and my fiance is both a mental health practitioner, but also a avid wire wrapper and mineral collector. So we have a lot of minerals here in the house. We have a lot of materials for experimenting with metal coils and tools to turn them and everything. So I threw in a bunch of different quartz crystals, and I got that effect out of all of them on all faces. It's actually incredibly easy to demonstrate. And again, like talking about looking for prior precedents for this, I was barely able to find any videos like this on YouTube. Like there was one guy who grew his own Rochelle salt crystal, which is also a piezoelectric material, and he demonstrated it on that because it was one that he grew to specific dimensions. But there was nothing on like how do you do this on a raw quartz piece, and I've always wanted to do that since I was a kid. finally had the equipment to do it. Finally had
cool.
The engineering background to sort of know what I'm doing. I'm not an electrical engineer, but we basically are in the field of mechatronics, which is the combination of mechanical and electrical. And I did, though, because there was this antenna created, see this 60 hertz background radiation, which is often created by your wiring in your house, which operates at 120 hertz. So 60 is a subdivision or a subharmonic of 120. So you see that a lot in oscilloscope readings. So I was like, okay, what if I ground the antenna then with a small wire, like from one electrode to the other, and then put the crystal in the middle? Will I still see anything? Because I'm grounding that path, right? The path of least resistance is just through that little copper wire that I put through the electrodes. And that's the experiment I tried last night. So this is actually pretty timely because I wouldn't have been able to talk to you about this on the podcast if we did it yesterday.
You're right. Totally.
So I put the raw chunk of quartz in between the 2 electrodes that were bridged by a small, really thin copper wire, enough to provide a ground but not a ton of conductivity. And then I tapped on the raw crystal again with this non-conductive like plastic stick, and I still saw it. So the piezoelectric effect was still being registered between the electrodes, even with a path to ground. And this honestly gives rise to so many more exciting experiments that I've been like kind of giddy the past several days because I'm so excited. I I think my partner is starting to get a bit annoyed because I'm not like spending enough time with her instead. But I really got to balance those things better when I'm really excited like this. But so there's a lot of other questions that come from that, right? So now that I know I can output a voltage by applying vibration to a piezoelectric raw quartz crystal, since the piezoelectric effect is reversible, what happens now when I apply voltage across and start to see if I can get these guys to hum? Because old piezo components in watches, a lot of the earlier ones, and these are of course integral in why quartz watches are called quartz watches. The quartz crystals inside them used to hum an audible frequency. So if you put your watch up to your head, up to your ear, you would actually hear it humming. And that was engineered out of those crystals years ago because like watchmakers didn't want people annoyed by their watches. They wanted to hear maybe like a ticking sound, but they didn't want to hear a constant hum coming from the thing. And it also reduces the efficiency because, you know, if you're creating this audible noise, you're basically going to be draining your battery faster on your watch, right?
True.
So good reasons to do it. But what that does highlight is that it is possible to get quartz crystals to not only resonate by applying the voltage, but to resonate at a frequency that you can hear. So I just ordered some new probes for the oscilloscope so I can actually go from the function generator output of it to those same electrodes and generate a voltage, an AC voltage, so oscillating, right, onto the crystal. And my next experiment that I'm really excited about is seeing if I can get these things to audibly hum or sing. And then if I can do that, then I can find crystals that hum at specific frequencies. I could create an instrument out of it.
Amazing. That would be so cool to actually create the music or, you know, that experience that those crystals would create by being linked in that way, but also just the whole visual aspect too of the experiment itself, and then the fact that there could be some type of report built around it as well. I don't know. There's so many awesome places where this discovery could lead to.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that it connects back to a lot of those metaphysical type beliefs that you were mentioning, right? Like your own personal conviction that there is something to the energetic aspects of crystals, and of course the fact that is something that if you look through anthropological history, most cultures have shared to some extent, whether it's celebrating these crystals or in the case of like South American Catholicism, they're fearful of them and basically taught to avoid this stuff. But
interesting,
you know, allegedly because crystals are stuff of the devil, right? So they're still containing some metaphysical force, whether it's for good or ill. And you know, there's a lot of talk in the more festival or hippie community, not using those terms to denigrate anybody, just terms.
Sure.
About, you know, vibrational energy in crystals and sitting down and feeling them, you know, vibrate noticeably. And the thing is, it's like I should be able to genuinely get that to happen, and I've already gotten the inverse to happen. So the big question is, do electromagnetic fields affect the piezoelectric effect, or is there a piezomagnetic effect that is demonstrable in quartz? So I also have on order a electromagnet that I'm going to incorporate into my experiments, and I'll maybe have a second podcast with you sometime about additional results from this stuff. But basically, I think instead of saying, oh, this is like the right way to look at these things, I think personally, based on my gut inclination, which is very much still oriented towards, or I should say I have a soft spot towards crystal healing, because I can tell you another story about that if we have time. We're already pretty far in here.
I'm up for it. Let's keep going.
Cool. But, you know, I have a sympathy for that stuff. And, you know, my partner does too. Although there's definitely more a sense of what is possible versus, like, we know what's real. Because I don't know for sure. But I do have feelings, and I do have, you know, a mind to apply. To anybody listening that might feel like this is kind of flying in the face of that, or I'm really extrapolating here. I'm not sure if anybody feels that way, and if so, my intention is really to lean in through more scientific, objective means, hopefully not objectable, into understanding more of what's going on. Because if there is something to crystal healing, which clearly Marcel Vogel believed, and he was an engineer specializing in crystallography and an inventor, responsible for everyday things that we have in our houses, all of us, then there could be something to that. So I'm hoping that as I continue to run these experiments and I find more objective applications for these things, mostly for creating music, but also because there isn't really documentation on this stuff out there on YouTube or on the internet, which means that people either aren't doing it or they're not sharing it. I'm not sure. I would like to share it. I would like to have those resources available. And I think this kind of augments and in a way reinforces a lot of more metaphysical and personal instinctive interpretations of what crystals are and what they do. Because they're out there doing a very similar thing every day in our devices, and that keeps the world ticking and keeps, all of our Zoom calls running over COVID, keeps our FaceTime call running right now. Like, it's already out there doing a huge amount of work, for human culture, and it has prior to this, though, prior to the commodification and the scientific rational harnessing of this energy, we were still holding these crystalline, structures to be special. I'm sure thousands of years ago somebody found a big quartz point coming out of a mountain, and they picked it up. They felt like that was something that deserved a lot of
treasure.
Yeah, it's treasure, right? Like the idea of a crystal goes way back, and it even applies to our current mythologies of Star Wars with the quartz or a kyber crystal being at the core of every lightsaber, and
it's just something that you would want to show people. Yeah, it's like, imagine coming back to camp and you just found this crystal and no one had ever seen one before. You're literally like, look what I just found. They'd be like, whoa! It just inspires awe,
They do, and that's I talked to my older brother about this, who is a PhD and way more academically rigorous than me in terms of like my attachment to crystals. And I feel like just by having a bunch on my desk, and I put them mostly over my monitors in my studio space, they just keep me excited. It's like
100%.
Frankly, the same reason why I still have some action figures is because they're just fun to look at, and I can play with them every so often, reach out and like immediately interact. But if you look at even the mythological context of again, I'm taking more modern day stuff just to keep it rooted in where we're at now in 2021. In Tolkien, the dwarves of Middle Earth had a really cherished object, and it was the Arkenstone, right?
Okay.
Which Smaug the dragon also coveted and hid in his pile of treasure, and it's like this special crystal.
Okay.
And you can find these types of both myths as well as historical context for using crystals throughout history. Another one is the navigating stones, or the sunstones that Vikings used to navigate the sea during cloudy days, and that's a really cool one as well, using optical calcite. So
I remember that.
Yeah. So optical
as well,
calcite,
like even like jewelry, diamonds are crystals, aren't they?
Yeah, the diamonds are incredible. In that, like, I'll come back to the Viking sort of like navigation stones in a minute, but diamonds shimmer in a really unique way because their crystal structure is so dense that it actually causes light to bounce around inside, so it changes the apparent speed of light of the photons coming out of the diamond. Right. They go in one way, they come out another, they come out being slowed down basically by the molecular structure because it's so dense, which is incredible.
That sparkle effect.
Yeah.
You'll see it when someone has like a flashlight on their phone and someone's wearing a diamond. You'll see like blues and reds coming out of it.
Yeah, I got the ring for my fiance for our engagement earlier this year, in part specifically because it casts a rainbow from the diamond.
Totally.
So that's definitely a special aspect for us. But the sunstone for Viking navigation was thought to be a myth for a long time, right? But it was determined fairly recently, I think within the past 10, 15 years, that it's a real thing. It's an optical calcite crystal that polarizes light. So during a cloudy day, you can look up at the sky and you can still see where the sun is. The clouds might obstruct it to your apparent vision, but as soon as you put this like polarizer up to the sky and hunt around, it will actually line up all of those scattered photons that were scattered by the clouds, line them back up into the crystal. It will allow you to see where the sun is, and they could use it to navigate, even in bad weather.
I love that. Yeah, I saw the example of that in the Vikings show.
Yeah, oh man.
They reenacted it.
That was that's a great show, although at times really hard to watch. I'm sure you know which scenes.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's crazy. It's good though. It's where we came from. It's crazy.
Yeah. So I'm just really interested to see where this stuff goes. Again, like I've been kind of surprised by there not being much out there on the internet about this.
Right.
It's kind of similar to what drives my music a lot. Is like I really want to hear a song and I go out hunting for it. I can't find it. There's lots of great songs out there and lots of amazing creators and people creating things that I never would have thought to come up with. But like every so often I have like this need for a sound that I know I can create, and I feel almost obligated to do it because it's not out there.
Sure.
And the same goes with this stuff. Like I just am not finding much information out there about it, and the people that are doing it, like Michael Lyko, aren't necessarily interested in applying like more of a scientific, rational approach to it. Right. And I almost feel like I just have to do this, so I'm super excited.
That's awesome. That's great. I love it. I mean, I feel like it's just always been part of who you were to me. I mean, to speak on how you came to me and entered my life, it was through a CD with a crystal on it. And I was like, this is freaking dope, you know? And it had like this really beautiful front image. I believe the CD was Crystal Consciousness, and you hear it and you've embedded all these amazing samples about crystals, and the music is just incredible and just feels like so timeless and organic. And then I don't remember. Oh yeah, I think we crossed paths in Austin and met in person, and then it was just like, dude, hell yeah, you know, just like on a very similar wavelength.
Yeah,
So that's awesome.
It's interesting. It's like that has been kind of baked into a lot of my creative work for a really long time, right? Like Crystal Consciousness came out in 2011, so this November will be at the decade mark of that release, which is crazy.
Ooh, we should celebrate that.
Oh, I'm totally down. I remastered that album, by the way. So
Beautiful.
If you go to Bandcamp now and you download it again, it's all remastered, and all my stuff is up for free or donation, so it doesn't cost anything.
Gotta peep that.
Yeah, I didn't really officially announce it or anything. I just happened to find that the master that I had before was not that great, so I went back and redid it and just snuck it back into the files, and I actually finally put it in for proper distribution through Spotify, etc. So Crystal Consciousness should be up on Spotify.
That's a great one. That's one of my favorites of yours. I mean, I love them all. You know, it's hard to decide which would be a favorite, but just based on nostalgia and it being the first stuff I heard by you and never having heard any other real music in the vein, it was just freaking incredible.
Yeah,
so good.
I'm glad you like it still. I mean, it's hard for me to kind of listen to my old stuff and think, oh, that was great, because I'm always wanting to do something better or different.
That's all musicians.
Yeah,
same here. It's
totally.
It's like I don't want to hear it. And it's funny because I'll be with my bandmate and, you know, one of our own songs will come on shuffle in the car or something. It's like, skip, you know? So we never want to hear it anymore. It's once you put it out, you've heard it to death. And then maybe you get excited for like the week or two that other people are hearing it, so you're listening again as if you're listening with the audience. But then after that, it kind of for a lot of artists, it just kind of dies, and it's like, that's in the past now.
Yeah, no, it's kind of funny because like I got a CD compilation recently from Touched Music in the UK, and they do some really awesome releases to support cancer foundations, specifically Macmillan Cancer Foundation. So basically raising money for cancer awareness and for treatment and research. And this compilation that I'm on is just bonkers because it has a track from Orbital, it has Future Sound of London on it, it has
Wow.
remix by Boards of Canada on it.
Let's go.
There's Dentel, which is, really beautiful IDM from like the early 2000s that then led into a collaboration with Death Cab for Cutie. But there's also on that compilation my track, which is a remix of Antediluvian Dub by a guy named Christ, who's my friend Chris, also a former member of Boards of Canada. And I'm looking at this compilation, it's just like packed with my heroes, right? And I'm on it, albeit remixed by another one of my heroes. And like
Full circle.
yeah, so I'm listening to the CDs and the music is excellent, really well curated. But as soon as my track comes on, which is still remixed by somebody else, but even then I'm like, skip. Like he did an excellent job, and it's still a totally different take on my track. But the fact that it's rooted in my own work, I want to get to the plaid track on the album. I want to get to the Future Sound of London. So
I know, it's funny how we're all like that.
If I look back on the work that I've done, though, there was an album called Crystal Consciousness. There's a track called Quartz Resonance. And I have a new track on Infraplanetary, which was released through your label, through Time Wheel. Called In Hydro. And that track samples one of the only documentary videos I could find on cutting and manufacturing crystals, specifically quartz for piezoelectric purposes and applications. So it's basically in the last 3 albums I've done, there's been a direct reference to this type of phenomenology, and I'm just finally starting to genuinely get hands-on with it. So it feels like I'm really integrating a lot of the interests and like hobbies and beliefs and creative decisions into a larger collective whole, and I'm really excited to see what that does for not only my music, but just, it provides me with a constant outlet for exploration, potentially for the rest of my life, that really draws a lot of these things together. So
100%.
I didn't do it on purpose, though, right? Like I wasn't planting those seeds in previous tracks and album titles to say, hey, this is what I'm going to be doing in 2021. Right. It just came together.
That's the beauty of art.
Yeah.
It really encapsulates our path in our growth. We can hear where we were at a particular time in the past by listening to our own music in the past and see how things kind of added up. It's really interesting because we're on this path of self-discovery. I think the art forms really help us unravel a lot of what it is we're kind of trying to get out. And then once it's in front of you, you can kind of connect the dots a little bit and say, oh, it makes sense why I was into this thing or that thing or this sound or this interest. And it all kind of accumulates into the life work that sometimes you can kind of get a glimpse of. It's like, what do I want my life work to be, like the embodiment of it? But at the same time, you never know where it's going to go until you get there.
Yeah, exactly. Like I didn't really think that a lot of the crystals that we have in our spot here could be used for experiments that could generate sound that I can use to control my Eurorack setup, And Xian, my partner, is really excited about that too because, part of wire wrapping is coiling wire, this conductive material around, in many cases, like a piezoelectric, or in the case of tourmaline, a pyroelectric material. And it's a very intuitive, very creative, art-driven process. But I'm doing something very similar in the other room with copper wire and crystals and conductive materials. So there's definitely an overlap there. So I've started to consider, I don't necessarily want to sell a product like Nassim Harriman is doing. And I think when you call it a product, that instantly raises red flags in my mind, to kind of go back to that topic. But maybe this could be used for creating new forms of art in wire wrapping as well, or other forms of, appreciating crystals and healing or meditation practices.
Absolutely. And it's also leaving a legacy for someone else to pick up on in the future. Like in 200 years, they might find your pamphlet and be like, oh shit, he was onto it. We're going to finish it. It's like we're helping the future.
I hope so. I mean, a lot of the stuff was done by like the Curie brothers, I think back in the late 1800s. But a lot of those early experiments weren't really written down. So like, again, experimenting with raw crystals that gave way pretty quickly to cutting and specifically, creating dimensions that were optimal for this effect. So the earlier, like the raw aspect of it is what I'm really interested in. Can I take a raw quartz crystal and put it into a socket on my Eurorack module and have it be another oscillator?
Yep.
There's a lot of different possibilities that come from that.
100%.
Yeah, I like
That's
that
a funny thing to think, though, about like almost like 200 years in the future, how someone would find your body of work, your life's work, and then be able to see what it was. And maybe there was some lapse in time where no one was doing these things, but you were the most recent person doing it, almost the way you're talking about how you got into this. And then someone else can continue on the path because they have that similar set of interests and abilities to continue to better the world. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. That's a cool concept to me.
Yeah, I mean, the only issue there though is that I'm not super good at like being a content creator, so to speak. So I'm really glad that we're talking about this on the podcast, because it might be a while before I get to like uploading any of this stuff to YouTube for just basic tutorial purposes.
And there's no rush, but I think it is someday.
Yeah, I mean, this has been around for a long time. The piezoelectric effect has been here well before human beings. So the thing is, though, is that I do feel like now a lot more motivated to potentially do that. And I don't know if I should wrap it into like my handle for music on YouTube, or if I create a separate science channel,
Right.
or how often it's going to be updated. But I do know I should share this stuff because, man, it's always exciting and a little disappointing, when you go hunting online for something and you can't find it.
Right.
Because we often now expect the internet to basically house all the secrets. If you dig long enough, you'll eventually be able to find whatever. And that obviously can be used for negative purposes, but also for research and discovering things about your, whatever your interest is. It's often like kind of an assumed or like a given that you can at least find a lot of initial stepping off points. Like every PhD student working on their dissertation has to find some area that has not been explored at the level or the angle that they're approaching it, right?
I think it's because we're, people like you, sometimes me, and a couple other people that I know and hang out with, is we're on the leading edge in a way. Like, we're asking questions that are new, or we're interested in things that maybe there isn't a lot of information on. Because I'll tell you, I'll go look for some answers about psychedelics and spiritual experiences and not find them too, the way that you can't find what you're looking for. So it's like we're asking questions that maybe haven't been answered yet.
Yeah, and to roll this back into artificial intelligence, right? Like, what if a future AI goes like scrubbing through all of these records through the Wayback Machine of the internet, and it's looking for details on these subjects? Because maybe say it's like it's writing 1,000 dissertations at once in the span of like 20 minutes or whatever. And if it doesn't find that information, then what does it do? If it doesn't actually have the ability to go out there and physically interact with the world, it's relying on us as its hands and its like physical body in many ways. This is like precluding any ideas of robotics and the interaction there with artificial intelligence. But by laying basically this paper trail or this like string of jelly beans for people to follow, who knows what else will follow? It might not just be people. It could be, in the far future, an artificial intelligence. It could be an extraterrestrial civilization. It could be, some next conscious species to evolve way beyond us. No idea how long our ideas will persist, but that's part of the excitement in exploring. I'm just, though, not personally very good at like sharing that stuff. So I love to personally explore, but I don't really like to. I almost feel like I'm showing off if I share it,
Sure.
Talking about this in a podcast is super casual, and
Totally.
Anybody can listen in their own way, in their own time, in their car, wherever they happen to be.
Right.
Hi, everybody. So, like,
what up?
Yeah, it's a lot more relaxed of an environment to discuss this in, but I am feeling a bit more drawn to share this stuff and my creative process for music. So.
I'm almost seeing an art journal, like you hear about, what are they called, manuscripts, but it's almost like a form of art to make a manuscript of your experiment. It's not that you even need to show it. It's just that to you, you enjoy it, and it brings joy to you and beauty. You know what I mean? So like I have a couple of little books that I used in the past that I still have that I filled up completely with just kind of like notes on meditations and spiritual insights and on this day I ate 3.5 grams of mushrooms and here's what I learned, like
Yeah.
that. I just have these little manuscript type things. And now what I would like to do and see, because I've been inspired by certain people who do spiritual journeying and then create like beautiful, like lasting forms of art from it, is almost create some type of personal journal manuscript.
Yeah. So again, just kind of like things coalescing together, this like emergent phenomenon. My partner gave me a bunch of crystal themed empty notebooks for Christmas.
There you go.
I have a pile of like notebooks on my desk that I'm experimenting on right now with the oscilloscope and the electrodes I was talking about, like next to these guys to write our future inspirational notes on this phenomena, and that somebody might find later. But even if they don't, I think it's just a good practice, right? Like it's just good to
exactly
sit down and like try to add more coherence to your thoughts, to your findings, and kind of reflect on them versus just continuing to engage in the action.
And I noticed too, like the actual conscious writing is good, because we have this automatic writing where we're just like transcribing as fast as we can go, and it's pretty messy and pretty dirty. But then with conscious writing, you're like actually taking your time with each letter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And kind of the spacing and maybe the formatting, and that act itself is like a type of meditation, but you're writing things that are coming out of you. But it's funny because I will look back in my old journals and I'll see some days I was just like transcribing as fast as possible, you know what I mean? And then other times it's like super well written and like super elegant, on the page.
Yeah,
that's funny.
That's part of the trouble I have with writing stuff down, is that I have a kind of specific expectation for penmanship and for the quality of like my diagrams or my drawings. And I like them to be almost evocative of something like, I wouldn't say Da Vinci, but my favorite like maker is Adam Savage, mostly known for Mythbusters, for example. Awesome guy.
Oh, yeah.
The Tested channel on YouTube is one of my favorites. But if you look at his drawings, that they're a combination between shorthand and really well meditated, thought out, like descriptions of how he's building something or his findings from a build process, and it does evoke that like Da Vincian sense of wonder to me. And that's kind of how I approach things too. Is like I like it to be exciting to go back and look at, like have it be a little piece of art unto itself. Exactly. And for that reason, sometimes I've been a little reluctant to engage in it because I want to do a really good job. But I had to get more comfortable with kind of like Adam does, combining the messy, like instant means of, just jotting something down with more of like a message for posterity or at least future reflection, and evoking this like sense of wonder in the way you're writing and the things you're writing about and the visual means you're using to augment that, whether it's a diagram or a sketch. So I definitely will be doing that for this project. I feel, again, really driven to do that. So
that's beautiful. Very cool. Well, you're up to some awesome things, man. This has been really great catching up. Thank you so much for your time. And I guess, just to finish it off, where can people discover your music and whatever you're up to recently?
Sure. Thanks again for having me, man. I'd love to do another one of these guys. We didn't even really get into music itself, which is, again, like awesome, because that's normally the thing we would talk about. Two musicians together on a podcast. Not talking about music is really fun, actually.
Totally.
We danced around it. But anyway, love to do another podcast talking about music specifically. But in the meantime, anybody that is curious can find the works that we described and other tracks and projects as well on skytree.bandcamp.com. And of course, I can also go to your site, which is timewheel.net, to find some Skytree content there. And if you're just Googling or anything like that, just be aware that there's the Tokyo Skytree, which is a tall structure in Tokyo. And then there's also Skytree servers, which are actually, going back to artificial intelligence, somewhat driven by machine learning to augment and maximize server efficiency. So I am not either one of those things, but skytree.bandcamp.com.
Awesome. Beautiful. Yes, I can't, speak highly enough of your music. I love it. It just feels timeless, beautiful. It still has some grit to it, just like that nasty whoop whoop, and it just feels great. You know what I mean? It's just very uplifting, and it feels positive and mysterious, and uh, again, very evocative of the mystical experience that is life. So, thank you for creating your music. It's incredible. And I hope everyone will go check it out and support on Bandcamp and timeworld.net. Again, thank you, Evan, for your time. This has been amazing.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for supporting my music, and thanks for your descriptor, too. I'm not really good at describing my own stuff, but you did an excellent job, so I appreciate that.
Hey, much love.